Morning, everyone. So I'm going to continue uh, the subject of the talk that I gave the last time I did one here, which was, I believe, about a month and a half ago or so. Uh, and I was taking a couple lines out of the Heart Sutra, or the Heart of the Wisdom of Great Perfection Sutra, as the longer name of it is. Uh, And the line is, or the couple lines are, thus bodhisattvas live prajnaparamita with no hindrance in the mind, therefore no fear. This is nirvana, or no fear, this is nirvana. And last time I focused on the notion of the hindrances in the mind, how hindrances are self-created, and how to work with the hindrances directly that we find in our practice or in our life. And I'm going to touch on that just a little, but I wanted to kind of move in a slightly different direction with some of this material also. Uh, in doing a little additional research, well, let me just go back to some of the background that I gave last time for those of you who didn't hear it, which is the Prajnaparamita material is a huge body of Buddhist material that was evidently brought from India to China around the 7th century AD. Uh, the sutra that we chant, which we call the Heart Sutra, or there's various other translations of it, is a portion of the larger Prajnaparamita material, which is thousands of pages long. And in looking up the history of this, I encountered somebody that I've never knew about before. I may have read about him, but I didn't remember it. Um, and this was a Chinese monk by the name of Yuanzhang. And his Dharma name, which he probably received in India, was Mokshadeva. He lived during the 7th century in China, and at age uh, 27, he began a 17-year trip to India. And I'm assuming he was traveling along the Silk Road, or what later became the Silk Road, or was called the Silk Road. Um, and just think about doing a 17-year trip to get from China to India. That was quite an effort. I'm not sure he was the first Chinese monk to do that, but he was probably the best known because upon his return a number of years later to China, the emperor of the area, or the king of the area that he lived in, and this was Tang Dynasty China, where Zen, during that era, Zen was quite popularized. A lot of the famous teachers in our koan collection are from that same era. But this particular ruler welcomed him home, and because I guess he had Buddhist leanings himself, and and actually encouraged him to do like a travel log of his time, his travels and his time in India, which he did. And it became quite popular among people who studied Buddhism at that time. So he himself studied at Nalanda University in India, the famous Nalanda University, which was a huge center of Buddhist learning, which built over centuries during a time when Buddhism was at that time one of the predominant, or probably the predominant spiritual practice or religion in India. When he departed from India to go back to China, he had 20 pack horses carrying all the texts that he brought back with him. And supposedly, as the records show anyway, um, the longer version of the Prajnaparamita Sutra, from which our shorter version that we use is taken, was carried back to China with him. It was one of the texts that he brought back. There were probably scrolls, I would imagine, at that time. So this guy really put in a lot of time and energy, virtually his whole life, to bring these texts back. And many of those texts were then studied in China, and there was a real renaissance and the development of the Mahayana school of Buddhism happened around that time in China. Um, and so we really owe the study that we do now to people like that, that, put their whole life effort into things back then. So last time I focused, as I said, more on the notion of the hindrances in the mind. And all of us encounter hindrances whenever we meditate. We all encounter hindrances in our life. And basically, from the Zen perspective, hindrances are, at least from my perspective, I'll put it that way, hindrances are simply uh, places to practice. In fact, they're our best points to practice at. Um, but if you expand that a little further, the way the sutra reads, first it speaks about bodhisattvas living prajnaparamita. So the word prajna in Sanskrit refers to wisdom, is translated as wisdom. Paramita is basically perfection or the perfections. So the precepts we take are called paramitas because they're considered to be activities that engage the human mind in such a way to create a kind of perfection within the mind in a certain sense. So prajna paramita really refers to the perfection of wisdom. And that's how it's translated sometimes, the perfection of great or great wisdom uh, is another way it's translated, the perfection of great wisdom. So they don't just say, well, study this or read about it. They say bodhisattvas live prajnaparamita. So, in other words, the notion is that we can actually live the teaching. And, from a Zen perspective, that is what it's about. If we're not living the teaching, then we haven't fully experienced the teaching. One thing is to read about it or to think about it. The other thing is to actually incorporate the teachings into our very body and mind. And I think last time I spoke quite a bit about the somatic aspects of how the body, which is often overlooked in this process, is where we do a lot of our practice with the sensation and the formations within the body mind. So, in looking at this material a little longer, I started realizing that last time I missed the whole notion of the mind that was present there. So, the idea in Zen is that hindrances in the mind, or what we experience as hindrances in the mind, are present because we don't fully understand the nature of the mind, and we're not living, quote unquote, the prajnaparamita in that sense. So if if our notion of mind is a very confined notion, if we experience the mind as a shell around us, or as a kind of like a box that we're trapped in, uh, then it's impossible to really view, I believe, hindrances in the way that I'm talking about. Then they become obstacles. We regard this as an obstacle or that as an obstacle. For instance, where we're sitting here in the building that we're in currently, we're very close to the railroad tracks, and there's the high-speed train that goes by several times on Sunday morning. There's the sound of the traffic because we're close to a major artery, US 1 in Florida. And then we also are pretty close or right really in downtown Melbourne. And so there's people walking by going to brunch and things like that uh, with kids in tow and dogs and whatever. So you could regard those sounds, for instance, as obstacles to meditation. But those who've sat with this group know that we've always been in noisy places. All of our buildings have been on noisy streets. And so if you're going to sit with this group, you have to kind of let that go, that the noise is a hindrance. And we can, and people learned to do that early on when we first started sitting at our our initial location, it was in probably the noisiest of the 4 or 5 places we've been since we started here. And so we kind of got trained to sit with the noise and just to experience the noise as noise and not as hindrance. And that's a good example of how our viewpoint, our perspective of what we're experiencing really determines whether something is a hindrance or not. Uh, and our notion of the mind, what I was trying to get to a few minutes ago, is our notion of the mind, our idea of what the mind is, and how, on a larger note, how we experience the mind, actually feel the mind or experience it with our whole body and mind. That really determines whether we're able to see uh, emptiness in all things, which is basically what the Heart Sutra is about, with no hindrance in the mind, no hindrance, therefore no fear. So it's pointing to the fact that hindrances create fear, and then fear, once things have devolved from viewing something as a hindrance to the level of fear, then we're suffering whether we like it or not. So alternatively, if through our practice and the various things that we do spiritually and psychologically, if we can begin to start experiencing, not just viewing, not just reading about this, but experiencing the mind as something that doesn't really exist. And by it not existing, what I mean by that is no idea we have of it really embraces the totality of it. And we all have ideas about it. I have ideas about it too. Um, Everyone's got an idea about what their mind is or the mind is. But in Zen practice, the idea behind everything we do is bringing ourselves to the place or being brought to the place, like a better way of looking at it, where those limits to the mind itself begin to drop away. And when the limits to the mind itself drop away, then what starts happening is the hindrances and hence the fears that develop or devolve from the hindrances are experienced in a much more huge or gigantic context. So it doesn't mean that there aren't hindrances. It doesn't mean that there still aren't things that we regard as hindrances, but we see them within a huge, gigantic, or maybe you could even say infinite context. So, for instance, if I'm in this room with a wasp that I'm allergic to, I might have some fear because this is something that I do have. I have an allergy to certain kinds of wasps. So if I was stung by the right kind of wasp, it could technically kill me. Um, I don't know if it would or not. It's been many years since that happened, but it came close to it the first time. So, so if I'm in a small room with this wasp, then my attention really has to be on where is that wasp and what is it doing and what am I doing? But if that wasp exists if I'm down at the beach and the wasp is just flying around and it's got a gigantic amount of space to fly around in, then I'm probably not going to have the same viewpoint of the wasp because the space in which it can move is so much larger. And similarly, when the hindrances in the mind, which create the fear, which then we suffer as a result of, uh, when those hindrances are experienced in a matrix, so to speak, of an infinite field of consciousness, rather than a box or a shell that we view that kind of sits around us or is around us, then that changes the nature of life, our life in general, and then we're living in the Prajnaparamita. We're living in accord with that wisdom that the sutra is teaching. So living in accord with the wisdom and experiencing our body and mind as that, uh, then the the trajectory of our life, often, I think for most people that have that experience and live that experience, our life shifts to that is what we That is what our life is about, rather than all the other things that our life can be about. When I say about, I mean like our central purpose for living, our central purpose for living. Uh, and then when we're able to see it in that way, then anything that we experience, anything that goes on, can be a practice point, or what I like to call our practice edge. For me, the practice edge is the place where we begin to feel uncomfortable, where all of our teaching and all of our meditation and the other practices that we've done don't seem to really be reaching where we're at. We're suffering again, and sometimes I think there's a tendency to think, well, why is this not working? Uh, this is not consistent with my view of the emptiness of all things. Well, that's because uh, we haven't dropped we haven't dropped our ideas of the mind and our ideas of what are going on in such a way that we're able to see it in a larger perspective, which is just a minute thing rather than a gigantic thing that's right in our face or right in the room with us. So the practice edge is wherever it starts to get to be uncomfortable. Um, that's a really good place to go to in our practice. And sometimes we have to feel that. This goes back to the somatic aspects of this, that we experience in our very body when we're meditating, wherever our practice edge is. And sometimes meditation alone doesn't seem to be enough. I know it wasn't for me, just the meditation, although I love the meditation and I promote it and I still do it myself whenever I can. Uh, Tremendous, of course, value to that. It's central to what Zen is about. But whatever we need to do to expand you could say expand our consciousness, but that's I think, backwards perspective, because when we say we're expanding our consciousness, we're saying, well, I own it. It's almost like it's a it's a creation of my ego, and I'm going to expand it out. Consciousness is already expanded. And that's why in Zen, we say that we talk about enlightenment as being realization. In other words, realizing what already exists, not expanding something. Although you could view it that way as a skillful means of working with your mind. But ultimately, I believe consciousness just is. And as we practice and go deeper and deeper into it, we realize that consciousness was always there. It's just that we weren't noticing it, or we were only noticing a piece of it. Could be argued that we're always only noticing a piece of it. I think actually that's probably the most accurate in my experience, that we're always only able to go so far with this. We're always only able to go to the point at which we're willing to let go and we're willing to really uh, experience that depth. That depth is what I think we all look for, and yet it can also be quite challenging uh, in the sense that if we're attached to things in this lifetime, that emptiness, that depth kind of uh, can show us that our attachment is based on an unreality, on a delusion of some sort or another. So we have the bodhisattvas living prajnaparamita, whether they know it or not. And this kind of goes back to something that my teacher, Genpo Roshi, said once. It's a few of the things that he taught have really stuck in my mind over the years. And he said, this is one of them. He said, everyone's a bodhisattva, but they all don't, everyone doesn't realize that they are. Um, so you can start from the notion of everyone's a bodhisattva, which I believe is true. Uh, but the level of understanding that that is the case varies with the number of people that there are. So everyone has a different understanding of it, and everyone is functioning from a certain ability to embrace the teaching as it's put forth in this sutra. And the purpose of the practice is to continue to deepen that. But I think we always have a practice edge we can work with. If we're not experiencing a practice edge, it's probably because we're not looking deep enough. Um, there's a tendency, I think, when we have a certain degree of realization to kind of hang out there because we like that. We like where we're at. And plunging into the depths again can be quite challenging to our notion of whatever awakening or enlightenment that we feel like we've accomplished. And that's still an ego-based practice at that point. In other words, the focus of that is the ego becoming enlightened, or the ego kind of owning uh, this consciousness and using it in a certain way. Whereas from the deeper Zen perspective, it's that we are just an expression of that consciousness, and everything we experience is also an expression of that consciousness. It's not really ours. We don't own any of it. And so if we can really begin to see things this way, we can really let go of the need to proselytize or try and convince others of it, or try and negate other people's ways of experiencing it or other people's ways of approaching it and practicing that, because we can't judge that. In the other sutra we chant the identity of relative and absolute. It says, "Do not judge by any standards." Don't apply any standard to judgment, just experience. And the reality and what works for you will then become clear. What works for you may not be what has worked for me or what continues to work for me. That you have to experience the practices to see whether it resonates or not. Whenever anyone contacts me about becoming a student, and most of the people that do that these days are people that don't live around here. They're people I'm uh, working with via Zoom. Our first meeting, people say they want this information or that information, but really, what I usually tell them, well, let's just talk for a while and see if there's any resonance there. Let's see if we resonate. If you feel a teacher-student relationship. That's more important than any specific information I could give them about whether the relationship's going to work or not. And sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. So uh, I guess what I'm getting at by doing a talk on these same few lines twice in a row is that I could probably talk on these same two lines for every talk I do this year. Because the more I look at it, the more I see. Similarly, when I'm working with koans with people, uh, some of these koans I've been through, I'm sure over 100 times with people over the quarter century I've been doing this work, but I notice new things all the time. So there's a real value to continuing to come back and re-looking at things. Uh, Especially the deep stuff like reading Master Dogen or Rinzai or whoever. And I can't say I spend a lot of time doing that kind of study these days. I don't, to be honest. But when I do go back to it, I see things that I didn't notice before because I've changed. My perspective has changed. And my practice edge has moved deeper. I still have a practice edge, but it's a different practice edge than it was a year ago or 10 years ago or 50 years ago, 50 odd years ago when I started doing this. So let's go ahead and open it up now. If there are any questions or comments, feel free to speak up.